are going mad today. Hey, hey, fellas are just as bad, I'll say.
Go anywhere, just stand and stare. You'll think they're mad when you look at the clothes they wear.
Masculine women,
Feminine men,
which is the rooster,
which is the hen.
it's hard to tell them apart today and say, sister is busy learning to shave.
Brother just loves his permanent wave.
It's hard to tell them apart today. Hey. Girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a tot.
Now we don't know who is who or even what's what.
Maud's got a sweater up to her chin.
Pa's got a corset holding him in.
Those masculine women and feminine men. Stop, look, listen, and you'll agree with me. Things are not like they used to be, you see.
You say hello to Uncle Joe, but look again and you'll find it's your Auntie Flo.
Masculine women,
Feminine men,
which is the rooster,
which is the hen.
it's hard to tell them apart today and say, Auntie is smoking, rolling her own.
Uncle is always buying cologne.
It's hard to tell them apart today.
In the hall?
Oh, there you go. Oh. You go in to give your girl a kiss in the hall.
But instead you find you're kissing her brother Paul.
Mom's got a sweater up to her chin.
And Pa's got a corset holding him in.
Those masculine women and feminine men. Masculine women,
Feminine men,
which is the rooster,
which is the hen.
those masculine women and feminine men.
So good evening and welcome to Reverb, a queer history experience. This is part one, Just One of the Boys with Jillian M. Roger. We couldn't be more excited to have her with us tonight. This is presented by the American LGBTQ+ Museum in partnership with Culture Lab LIC, where we are now in this beautiful space. I'm Essie Lucier. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the American LGBTQ+ Museum. And I'm going to hand it over to Tess Howsam to talk about Culture Lab, who's the artistic director here and is an amazing host and collaborator.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm going to go front and center. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here on this very dreary, very wet Saturday. I'm Tess Howsam. I am the artistic director of Culture Lab. Thank you. And I am so thrilled that we are doing this partnership. This is really aligned with everything that Culture Lab really stands for, a part of our mission. And I'm so glad that maybe some of you, this is your first time here. Many of you, who knows? We do a lot of great events. We do free concerts all summer long outside in our parking lot, May through October. Also, we have cultural food pop-ups. So if you're hungry and like to eat around the world like we do in Queens, come back out and eat with us. We also have a performing arts program that is a residency program. Culminates in a New Works Festival, so if you're a performing artist, those applications will go out in October. And the last thing I'm going to say before I get off the stage is we also right now have an open call for art for our June and July exhibition. It's called Unframing Gender. I'm curating it with a co-curator who's from Pakistan. It'll feature artists' artwork from South Asia as well as America. So if you're a fine artist or a performance artist, what have you, look for that call and hopefully we can get involved. Thank you all again for being here. Back to the important folks.
Hi everyone, welcome to Reverb. I'm Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I'm the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ+ Museum. We're so glad you are here with us tonight. For those of you who have attended public programs at ALM in the past, thank you. Welcome back, we love you. For those of you encountering the museum for the first time tonight, we still love you, but we're gonna tell you a little bit more about the museum. The American LGBTQ+ Museum is a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ+ history and culture. The museum's vision is a world in which all people work toward and experience the joy of liberation. In our new home, which we will open in 2027, New York's newest museum will tell the stories of queer peoples in this country, past and present, and in the continuum of time that connects us to our rich and powerful legacy. The museum will be a beacon for people around the world and around the country who haven't yet tasted queer liberation. It will be a space of celebration, commemoration, and deep meaning, a space where the connection to our ancestors will be strong and queer magic real. ALM will also be a space for activists, partnering with others who work toward the liberation of LGBTQ+ peoples and supporting the work of rising generations who will fight for new possibilities for queer peoples and for all people. And you do not have to wait until 2027 to be part of it. You can attend our public programs like you're doing right now. You can tell a friend. You can come to our traveling exhibitions. You can follow us on socials, become a member for $72 a year or $6 a month. Subscribe to our newsletter, join our queer book club. There's many ways to be engaged as our story continues to unfold. You want to talk about Reverb?
Yeah, why the reason for the evening. So Reverb, as Tess mentioned, is an immersive program series that connects the echoes of queer history to the present through captivating history lessons and live performances like you just witnessed. There will be more of those throughout the night, so please stick around, stay tuned. Participants can explore archival materials and ephemera that highlight a unique aspect of queer history, showcasing how it reverberates, and those reverberations continue to shape and influence the community. Tonight in the space, you will experience a site and event-specific 20-channel video installation featuring performances by national and international drag kings as documented by Rachel Rampelman, who's in the house, a collaborator, the creator of Life is Drag, which is the world's largest digital archive of drag. This installation is in the back corner right here, so please, at intermission or even after the show tonight, please go check it out. It's amazing. And of course, we have live music and performance, as I said. And now we're going to introduce Jillian.
Thank you. To open our program, it is now our pleasure to introduce our host lecturer, Dr. Jillian M. Rodger. Jillian Rodger's ongoing research interests cluster around popular musical theater of 19th century America and working class popular culture. She has written monographs, Champagne Charlie and Pretty Jemima, that explores the early history of variety theater, the form that preceded vaudeville, and its connections to other musical theater forms, including minstrelsy and burlesque. Her second book, Just One of the Boys, considers male impersonation in the context of U.S. variety entertainment. She has also written about theater law and moral reform in New York State. You're doing a lot, Dr. Jillian. Showing how variety theaters were run and indeed how what could appear on their stages was shaped to a large extent by changes to theater law and the threat of police raids. Her article, He Isn't a Marrying Man, Gender and Sexuality in the Repertoire of Male Impersonators, 1870 to 1920, reveals that until the 1890s or later, female-to-male cross-dress performances were intended to subvert class rather than gender or sexuality. Her most recent work focuses on vaudeville history and seeks to reframe the narrative in a way that connects her work to the established history of the form. She is also working on a project centered on the music of Tony Pastor's theater. Dr. Rodger's work on popular culture extends to the late 20th century. She has examined the performance strategies employed by the Scottish singer Annie Lennox, arguing that this performer employs tactics not unlike those of 19th century character singers in her approach to music, and through this performance provides an ongoing and cutting critique of gender. In all of her work, Rodger focuses on song and singing, and particularly on song as a dramatic moment. She argues that in non-narrative theater, that is, theater without a linking or overarching narrative structure, song functions to provide narrative periods in the performer's act. Popular songs on the late 19th and early 20th centuries relied heavily on stereotypical characters and scenarios, and the skills of the performers were instrumental in bringing these songs to life. Thank you so much for being here with us, and enjoy Dr. Jillian's lecture.
There was a lot of cross-dressing. There was just a lot of cross-dressing, more than we can, usually more than we imagine. So we have important dates in the history of cross-dressing, and I'm only talking women to men. It's not that I don't like men to women, it's just that I don't study them. So the first important date is the Restoration period. Before that, there were no women on the English stage. I'm actually mostly going to concentrate on the English tradition because the American tradition is an extension of that. And so after a break where the Puritans banned all theatre, we then have the restoration of the monarchy, and at that point women start to enter the stage, and almost immediately they start taking male roles. I've nodded at the presence of women already on the Italian stage, because when managers couldn't afford to hire castrati, they hired women because women were cheaper. And so we have that tradition as well. And then by the 19th century, you just have cross-dressing proliferating. There's more and more opportunities to see women in pants. So the first actress renowned for taking male roles was Nell Gwyn, who was also the mistress of Charles II, had 2 sons with Charles II, was scandalous, therefore very, very popular, and crowds flocked to see her in the theatre. Nothing has changed. You can see that in the first picture, she probably is in a male role, but you wouldn't really know because the femininity is heightened. So the next thing we have is by the 19th century, actresses are common on the stage, but the problem is that their roles are really boring because women are supposed to be compliant, gender normative. They're basically supposed to be good all the time, which doesn't give the actresses much of a range when it comes to what they do on the stage. What we start to see is that some actresses, never very many, but some actresses start to take male roles, particularly when they had a benefit performance. This is a performance at the end of the season where all of the dough goes to them. If they could attract more people, they got more money, and so that they often took male roles as a result of this. And we start to see women doing this more often. The most not really notorious, the most famous is Charlotte Cushman, who was always renowned as an actress. She was particularly admired in male roles because they said she was very intellectual, unlike most women, that she was masculine in her bearing. And when they said that, they were actually praising her and they weren't critiquing her. They admired all these qualities in her. And she acted often with her sister, who, when they did Romeo and Juliet, her sister was Juliet. In the middle, we have Romeo. Oh, I know, we're not going to go there. In the middle, we have Susan Denon, who was another leading actress of the day in the role of Romeo. And then finally, Alice Harriet, who was an English actress in Hamlet again. Now, we might be surprised to see Hamlet there. Hamlet was not actually a very popular role for men in the 19th century because they viewed him as being weak because he was seen as going insane by the end of the play, and therefore they didn't want to touch him. They preferred to play other characters in that play. Romeo was a boy, so Romeo was perfect for women because women had traditionally played roles of pages, young boys. This is also true in opera. It's true if you've seen Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. Cherubino is a perfect breeches role. He's a scamp. He just makes mischief all the time, and that's the kind of role that women often played. So by the later 19th century, you start to see actresses taking much more serious roles. Probably the person most famous for doing this is Sarah Bernhardt, who was renowned for her skills as an actress, and in her middle and older age increasingly took male roles. And the other picture is of Maud Adams, an American actress, and I forgot the E on her name, sorry, I always forget how to spell it, and in the same role. What's interesting is that she played that role literally weeks after Bernhardt had performed it in New York in French, and the critics preferred Maud Adams because they found Sarah Bernhardt disturbing. They found her energy disturbing. She was just scandalous, and they thought that she was not good in that role. And the slightly more refined, slightly more restrained acting of Maud Adams was much preferred by the critics, who really, they found Sarah Bernhardt just to be a little bit too much. Another strand of cross-dressing that's important through the 19th century is sensational roles. These come out in, there's a bunch of different strands, all of which are forgotten. There's burlesque, which we'll deal with in a moment. This is literary burlesque, not stripping burlesque. There's also a kind of play that we could no longer do called hippodrama. Hippodrama was horse equestrian drama, where the horses honestly were the star of the show, and they would traverse the stage. They actually had them on a stage, and they were trained to go around all of the sets. They periodically fell. The actresses who took these roles periodically broke bits of themselves when they were injured by the horses, and occasionally died. The most famous role of this kind was Mazeppa. And this is on the far side of the screen is Ada Isaacs Menken in the role of Mazeppa. This was a photo taken by the Disdairy studio in Paris. And if you look at the photo, you'll find out she's actually naked from the waist up. I don't think they could have taken that one in New York. And she performed that role beginning in around 1861 and performed it all the way through to the end of her life. We also have her in The French Spy. The thing to notice about these costumes, not the Mazeppa one as much as the French Spy one, is that it's quite clear you're looking at a woman, even though they're playing a male role. As with Nell Gwyn, as with the 18th century roles, the theory is that the men in the audience loved this. This was as much for the men in the audience as anybody else. And there have been feminist scholars on one hand say, well, what they did was model possibilities for women in the audience. And then there is another strand of thought that says, no, actually, they were just there so men could see their bodies. And there was, at the time, critique from feminist actresses such as Olive Logan, who started to see this kind of sensational drama as not being good for the profession, because she wanted to make a living at the profession. And when there were women who were stripping near naked, or literally naked, and performing on the stage, this then endangered her decency, and decency comes to be the thing that dominates the rest of the century. Here's three more Mazeppas. We have Kate Fisher. I don't have any information on her. It's very hard to find out much about her. We have Kate Vance on the other side, and in the middle we have Leo Hudson, who I believe Leo Hudson died after having a horse fall on her. Yeah, it was like her 14th injury as in playing that role, and they thought she was going to be fine, and she ended up dying from internal hemorrhage several days later. Acting was, we can't do it now because we have workplace safety rules. It's really hard to explain what went on the stage in the 19th century. It was extremely dangerous. So beginning in the 1860s, you start to have actresses move into literary burlesque. They'd always been there, but literary burlesque had been It's a British form in which there are male and female characters. The male characters had been performed by men. It was written in iambic pentameter, in rhyming duplets. Like, it sounds like something we really want to see, right? And Lydia Thompson transformed this into the worst kind of sex show ever. We're not talking 20th century burlesque with tassels and twirling, but we are talking a kind of form in which chaos reigned. Everyone on that stage but one person was a woman. And while they took literary stories, so you get things like Ixion. I'm not even sure what that, it's a sort of classic story. You also get Robinson Crusoe, you get the Arabian Nights, you get those sorts of stories being told. Every male character is performed by a woman, dressed along these lines. Often you can see Lydia Thompson's actually dressed as Robinson Crusoe in that performance. Pauline Markham, it looks like she's a sailor. And then Pauline Hall in the middle is a later 19th century actress, but she's dressed as a prince. So those are all men. You have the principal boy, which is the star of the show. You have the second boy, who's the sidekick. Then you have a principal girl, who's the love interest of the principal boy, and a second girl, who is the sidekick to the second girl, to the principal girl. And then you have a chorus of mostly women who also dance. And the one role that is played by a man is the role of the dame. If anyone's seen Gilbert and Sullivan, you know that one alto who's never married at the end, but performed by a woman? That is the dame role. So Gilbert and Sullivan are burlesques, but they didn't like cross-gender castings, so they just cast them normally, but they maintained the roles. So the heroic boy is always very effeminate, even when performed by a man. It transforms the way you watch Gilbert and Sullivan if you know those conventions. So this then dominates the United States through most of the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. And it's sensational because these women do not follow the script. The plays are scripted, but they constantly break from the script. They address members of their audience directly. They break that fourth wall. They also interpolate songs, sometimes from operetta, sometimes from minstrelsy and variety. So they're borrowing working class songs and bringing them up into what had been essentially a decent form. They smoke, they stride around the stage, they swear, they just behave in ways that decent women didn't in those days, and they're also dressed semi-naked. These are the women that Olive Logan was the most disturbed by and wanted to get rid of because she thought of them as a real threat to her well-being. So, in burlesque, I just want to basically contrast or give a sense of what they were doing. This is just a summary of what I've just said. We need to think about the mixing that happened here and the kind of irreverence that was really fundamental to this form. So, male impersonators appear at about the same time. The very first male impersonator in this country was Annie Hindle, who was dressed as a soldier, and she arrived in 1868 having performed briefly in English music hall for somewhere between 2 and 4 years. She was somewhere between 18 and 20 years old. She's a very frustrating figure to follow because it's impossible to know when she was born. Some people think, oh, it was in the mid-1840s. I've got approximately 1850. She was never reviewed in England as though she was a child, and I figure once she hit 14 or 15, she would have been she had to at least be 14 or 15 when she was performing there. Ella Wesner, who was her first rival, and I think also someone that she gave music to in order to start her career, was born in Philadelphia, had danced from about 1850 until about 1870, which, if you think about it, I mean, she was about 29 when she transitioned into male impersonation. She had acted for a couple years in Galveston, and she was getting old to be dancing. Ballet families kept one girl on the stage, and she was the designated survivor of that family. Her role was to continue to work to bring money in that then got channeled back to the family so that they would survive. Because there were 6 girls, all of whom had danced, and her nieces and nephews, or her nieces also entered the stage and danced. And so we have this multi-generational ballet family. So to contrast this with burlesque, male impersonators, their first role is to be comedians, not to be skilled singers, not necessarily to be skilled dancers. They have to capture the audience's attention, and they do it through song. But they also have spoken comedy that happens in the context of that song, and they have to be able to control their audience because their audience is ready to jump in at the chorus and basically run away with the performance at any given moment. So they were incredibly skilled performers. Most of them in this early period were older women who'd learned the skills on the stage and could control their audience and perform comedy, which is not something that women did. The first female comedians performing comedy as women didn't happen until the mid-1880s. And they weren't common until the 1890s and later. So this was the only way that women could be broadly funny, as opposed to charmingly cute and a little bit amusing on the stage. The other thing that's important is that there was no script. They improvised everything in the context of songs. The songs gave them a character, so they could be a gentleman, they could be a working man, and they had to take their cue from the song. They also talked directly to the male audience, but they did so as though they were equals to their audience. They teased them as though they had more knowledge about courting women. Some cases they might have. We also have to think about the difference in terms of sexual appeal. Their goal was not to be sexually appealing to the men in the audience. Their goal was to bond with the men in their audience. I'm not saying that men didn't write love letters to them as both men and women. There are records of this. It was reported in the newspaper as an amusing item that they had letters from women who wrote to them as men, and they had letters from men who wrote to them as men. So they certainly had men fall in love with them, but that was not their goal. And unlike burlesque performers, burlesque performers existed to elicit a sexual response, and male impersonators didn't. And just as evidence, here are some other acts that were on the stage at the same time. We have an anonymous, I don't know who she was, but she was gorgeous, serio-comic in short skirts. We have the Kleintop sisters who did formation dancing in near nakedness. And then we have Ella Wesner. Ella Wesner was not trying to get men to fall in love with her as a woman. So what did they do on the stage? They portrayed men. As I said, sometimes those men were working men. They gave advice to men on how do you woo a young woman? How do you court her in a way that you're not going to get her father come after you with a shotgun? Right? Because the working men in that period lived in a sex-segregated world, and the only women they had any kind of casual contact with were prostitutes. And if you intend marrying a woman, you cannot treat her as though she's someone that you pay for sex. You just cannot. And so Annie Hindle, Ella Wesner, and the other performers, and there was only a small number of them, talk to the men in their audience about how to get over their nervousness, how to get over their anxiety. The most popular song, however, there were two really popular songs. First, drinking songs that praised alcohol, and second, swell songs that depicted high-class men. And this is what I like to think of as the class warfare portion of their acts. And I've brought up Highway to a Dozen More Bottles, just so you get a sense of the lyrics. The thing to note is the first line, first verse, where she says, "Lovely woman was made to be loved, to be fondled and courted and kissed." And personally, I can imagine her spotting some really inadequate dude in the audience and kind of rubbing it in, like, I know how to do this and you don't, right? And the fellow who's never made love to a girl, well, they don't know what fun they've missed. So that they lean into that kind of thing. But then when you get to the chorus, you recognize how much nonsense there is. This is designed to be sung by the audience. And then as we go through the verses, you notice that he gets drunker and drunker as he goes. This is the first rule of working class masculinity. You are supposed to drink, and you are never supposed to show you're drunk. So what he's doing is saying, well, this is a high-class man who thinks he knows everything, but guess what? He's just a woman in a suit, right? He is just inadequate because he can't even hold his alcohol. And that is the message that comes through in a lot of these songs. This one is I'm on the Teetotal, and this was sung by Ella Wesner. This one is even more pointed in its critique. And it's set up like a kind of a sermon where this is a high-class man, an upper-class man who is at a temperance event, and he's preaching to his fellow sinners about avoiding alcohol. But you also notice that he's talking about how much alcohol he has consumed. And when he started as a young person, you can also see it's a very punny kind of song. The humor in these is really hard to follow now because we don't understand the conventions of language. But what we do get is, hang on, let's see. Oh. Well, cut off the top of but what we have here is interpolated commentary. So the song stops, and she talks directly to the audience, and we have him getting the DTs because he's trying to get off the booze. And his doctor is saying, ease off it gently, and tells him, take your noggin of gin at breakfast, okay? Your Irish hot at lunch and your bottle of port at dinner. In other words, that's moderate, right? And then as we go further forward, we even see here stage directions. And what you realize is the man has, in all of his pockets, he has different bottles that are labeled quite prominently with different kinds of alcohol. So we then have we have indications of what happened on the stage. We have to, oops, sorry. Yep, I've omitted several verses because this goes on for a long time. It has lots and lots and lots of interpolated stuff. But you notice by the last spoken interpolation, he's drunk. And it indicates this with slurred speech. And then the last chorus doesn't follow the choruses that have happened up until that point. It turns into, for he's a jolly good fellow. And the guy is completely out of it. So this is the kind of humor that these people were engaged in. And they basically performed from 1868, which is Annie Hindle's Arrival, all the way into the 1880s. You see this kind of humor. The thing that disturbs this, that interrupts this, is in 1873, the economy crashed. It completely tanked, and it was tanked until the late 1870s. And at that point, these actresses had to do whatever they could do to stay on the stage because there were theaters closing absolutely everywhere. And so in the second part of the talk, what I'm going to do is show what happens in the second half, or from 1880 to the turn of the century, or to the beginning of the 20th century. But this is the core of what the earlier performers were doing.
I'm Bert. Perhaps you've heard of me. Bert. You've heard word of me. Jogging along, hearty and strong, living on plates of fresh air. I dress up in fashion, and when I am feeling depressed, I shave from my cuff all the whiskers and fluff, stick my hat on, and toddle off west. I'm Burlington Bertie. I rise at 10:30, then saunter along like a toff. I walk down the Strand with my gloves on my hand, then walk down again with them off. I'm all airs and graces, correct easy paces, so long without food I forgot where my face is. I'm Bert, Bert, I haven't a shirt, but my people are well off, you know. Nearly everyone knows me, from Smith to Lord Rosebery. I'm Burlington Bertie from Bow. My pose, though ironical, shows how my monocle sticks to my face, keeps it in place, stops it from slipping away. Cigars, cigars, oh, I smoke thousands. I usually deal in the Strand. But you must take care when you're getting them there, or some idiot might step on your hand. I'm Burlington Bertie. I rise at 10:30, then Buckingham Palace I view. I stand in the yard while they're changing the guard, and the king shouts across, "Toodaloo!" The Prince of Wales' brother, along with some other, slaps me on the back and says, "Come and see mother." I'm Bert, Bert, and royalty's hurt. When they ask me to dine, I say no. I've just had a banana with Lady Diana. I'm Burlington Bertie from Bow.
One morning harmonized in love songs, he came in surprising our gang. When in Johnny there, so gay and debonair, then he commenced to croon this most romantic tune, Adeline. You heard him sing about sweet Adeline. Well, let me tell you, she's a pal of mine. She's fine. That's just why I'm going back again to see my Adeline. I'll write a letter and I'll add a line to tell her that I'm going to make her mine. Bells will chime for me and my sweet Adeline. One Sunday morning there was Johnny. With Adeline she looked so sweet. As they stepped down the aisle, she wore a happy smile. You should have heard the gang. Oh, how they cheered and sang for Adeline. You heard them sing about sweet Adeline. Well, let me tell you, she's a pal of mine. She's divine. That's just why I'm going back again to see my Adeline. I'll write a letter and I'll add a line to tell her that I'm going to make her mine. Bells will chime for me and my sweet Adeline.
Hello again. So, I just included these photos partly so you can see that it wasn't just Annie Hindle and Ella Wesner. We have Blanche Selwyn and Maggie Weston, who were part of the next generation to join these women on the stage. What ends up happening is in the 1880s, as the country is recovering from an economic downturn, actually arguably from the mid-1870s all the way through the end of the century, this country was like riding an economic roller coaster. And there were very often crashes. What this does is cause two things to happen. On one hand, you see more antagonism towards rich people. And on the other hand, in the face of immigration, you also start to see white working class folk identifying with middle class people and moving up. And both of those things come to bear during the 1880s. So in the 1880s, we have what we call dude songs that appear. And these are songs that depict men, high-class, fashionable men, as essentially, they use all of the stereotypes that we think of as the worst stereotypes of gay. So we have men who lisp, men who own poodles, men who cannot abide eating red meat, right? So this is the kind of song. There is some suggestion that this has got to do with Oscar Wilde's visit, but these figures don't look at all like Oscar Wilde. These are a distinct group of songs. And some of the men who were contemporaries of Wesner and Hindle were also singing these songs. So I think that there was a huge amount of class antagonism happening at this period. The other thing that's interesting is that with these songs you also see these are ones that just aren't a model at all. So the next kind of song that we see, or the next kind of strategy we see for survival, is to become a model for aspiring middle class and upper middle class men. So Annie Hindle here, we can see she's listed on Keith and Batchelder's Gaiety Museum. That's B.F. Keith, the vaudeville manager. This is early in his career. This is from the mid-1880s when he's just entered vaudeville. And he's employed Annie Hindle at his dime museum. She describes herself as Cupid's messenger and Apollo Belvedere. In other advertising, she described herself as the king of fashion, sometimes in French, which makes it super high class, right? So she is taking the second strategy, where Ella Wesner increasingly plays to class warfare. Annie Hindle is adapting because she needs to stay in work. So here's to contrast the performance style. In the 1870s, they're the same as the men in their audience. They're speaking directly to the men in their audience. Their appeal is that they could teach the men in their audience how to appeal to women, and they went together with them against higher class men. In other words, they were loaning their bodies to the men in their audience, so that the men in their audience were like, yeah, we know that high class man is just a woman in a suit. It's not unlike the term metrosexual that we used to deploy several decades ago, right? It's a kind of a critique that these are slightly effeminate men, too interested in fashion. By the 1900s, 1890s, 1900s, these women become models, literal models for men. When English performers came here, they marketed bits of their costume as fashion to be sold. So there were Vestatilly socks and Vestatilly waistcoats. When she first came to this country, and we'll get to her in a bit, she was wearing brocade waistcoats because they were old-fashioned, and she did it as a kind of class critique in Britain. When she came to the United States, they read her literally. And there was a sudden revival of the brocade waistcoat in the 1890s that can be put down entirely to the act of this one woman. So, what is driving this shift? And the other thing, too, is they depict younger and younger men. What is driving this shift is feminism. Because by the 1890s, we've got several generations. The feminist, the suffrage movement is up and running again after the Civil War. There are several generations of women arguing for the vote. Arguably, it takes a couple more generations one more generation for them to get it. But there's increasing anxiety around gender ambiguity, about what happens if women vote. They'll turn mannish. And here we have, this is part of a stereo view. It was a photograph that was marketed. It's called The Coming Woman. It's supposed to strike fear into you. In other words, feminists are either large fat women that no one wants to marry, or small sour women who've been passed over. And that's the moral of that particular postcard. What this does to women on the stage, who are women in public, who are women who are earning a living and a good living, is put them in the spotlight. And some of them say, like Maud Adams, correctly spelled this time, Maud Adams navigated this masterfully. She took the role Peter Pan. She was the first Peter Pan in the United States. You can also see a photograph of her in properly feminine attire. What you need to know about Maud Adams is she never married. She had 2 long-standing relationships with women. She refused to talk about her private life because she said the domestic sphere, she's nodding back to the 19th century, should remain domestic. I will not talk about it. And she therefore could stay decent because she had adhered to the most stolid of middle-class standards, and because she was never associated, her name was never associated with any man. She maintained respectability and she hid in plain sight. She took male roles, but she also took female roles, and she didn't concentrate too much on any of them in terms of, she didn't specialize in one kind of role, and she was never sensational. So it was just part of her being an actress. And she navigated her career quite successfully that way. That was very difficult to do. By the 1890s, we also start to see English male impersonators coming into this country. Vesta Tilley is in the middle. She is the oldest of the 3 that are depicted. Vesta Tilley was born in 1864. She went on the stage as a child, so she was already performing at 3 and 4 years old. By the time she got to about 8 or 9 years old, she, in her autobiography, says, "I decided that I should specialize in male characters." Coincidentally, Ella Wesner had spent quite a long time during the Depression, the Long Depression of the 1870s, working in England. She was there for at least 3 years. And she was performing at just before Vesta Tilley decided to take male roles. I cannot prove that she inspired Vesta Tilley, but she was hugely successful. And it must have, given how many young women there are and the competition to be a tuneful young woman, if you want to play comedy or a character, being a man is the best way to do it. So Vesta Tilley is one of the older of the male impersonators from England. We then also have Bessie Bonehill, who spent her time between narrative musical comedy, pantomime, which is a British form, and music hall, and then Ella Shields on the far side, whose songs have been heard here tonight. And Ella Shields, I'll talk about in a little bit, but she is an American who went to England at the beginning of the 1900s, largely because her career here wasn't succeeding, and then became a male impersonator once she got there. So, actually, I'm going to skip this because I have some video that I'll show at the end. So the male impersonators from England also were active in pantomime, and they were also much, much younger. So when when Ella Wesner was performing there, she was already in her 30s, she was in her mid to late 30s. There was another performer there who was 20 years old, who was placing advertisements in the local theatrical paper saying there's life in the old girl yet. Most of them were teenagers, and Vesta Tilley was not even 10. So you can imagine that a 35-year-old woman had a very different effect, especially one who was physically quite strong because she'd been a ballet dancer, who had muscles because she'd been a ballet dancer, who had stature because she'd been a ballet dancer. She was a completely different thing than the English performers, most of whom spent at least part of their year, usually 2 months a year, performing in pantomimes as a principal boy, and they switched backwards and forwards, and that made their performance style more feminine. Just as a matter of interest, I include a photograph of Ella Wesner there from probably the 1880s, 1890s. She also had to perform into burlesque because by that period she was struggling to find any work at all. And this is a cigarette card that was put in packs of cigarettes for men. They don't know that they're looking at a woman probably in her later 40s or mid-50s. They think they've got a sexy burlesque queen there. And these photographs circulated quite widely, often via newspapers such as the Police Gazette, which were catered to an entirely male audience. So by the end of her career, she's having to please a male audience. Okay, so by the early 20th century, we have Americans beginning to move into this more feminine style. We have Kitty Doner on one side, who was a dancer. You notice that there's a theme here. Often it's dancers who move into this performance style. And she was deemed by her father to be not pretty enough. So he taught her to dance, and then he suggested she become a male impersonator because she wasn't pretty enough to make a mark in musical theatre at the time, because the competition was very, very stiff. And so she made her name as a male impersonator, switched into female roles, and then ended up choreographing for Hollywood. So she became a backstage, sort of back of the house kind of person. Florence Tempest was an interesting character. She performed with her sister, and they had a sister act where they would sing duets together. She used a rather ambiguous Florenz, sometimes with a Z rather than a C. And when her sister was not available, she performed solo as a male impersonator. By the time she got into her 20s, critics were telling her, you need to get into a dress. And this was in review after review, that it's a pity that she insists on wearing trousers. And so eventually she teamed up with a man, put on a dress, and continued her performing career, and then fades. It gets very hard to track her after that. The last person is Della Fox, and Della Fox is an interesting case because she's someone who had appeared in musical comedy in the 1890s. She was a soubrette. She sang a sort of light soprano role, occasionally took male roles in musical comedy, which is not unlike the burlesque costume. And then she had a breakdown of sorts. It's not clear what was wrong with her. She was clearly worked very hard, and she was institutionalized briefly by her family. And then in the early 20th century, once she was back out and back on the stage, she launched her career as a male impersonator using nostalgia for her act or her plays in the 1890s, singing songs from those plays, but dressed more and more realistically as she aged. She died relatively young. Mostly, it was reported that she had appendicitis. I think she had appendicitis 6 times, so it was clearly a code for something else. It's not clear what that was, but it's likely it was either drugs or alcohol that degraded her health, and she ended up dying in the process of trying to make a comeback in narrative drama. She was someone booked as a headliner. By the time she really within the first decade, she had slipped so far on the bill, she was performing 3 or 4 times a day and sometimes couldn't perform. There are managers' reports saying that she's in no fit state to perform tonight. She missed this many nights this week. But they would hire her because the audience followed her because they remembered her from the previous decade. So this is an example of the later male impersonators that we have. Now, in terms of what happens after the 1920s, if you remember that, if you remember the stereo view, the coming woman, what happens is that young women start their careers as male impersonators, make a name, and then move into dresses, unless they're not white. The problem for women of color was that they couldn't be decent. There was no context in which they could be decent because the stage was segregated. And as a result, they got to live by our standards a lot more openly, but they were also in a lot more danger on a whole lot of levels. So we have Gladys Bentley, who comes from Philadelphia, comes up to New York as a teenager, is working in gay clubs in Harlem, and is reputed to have been able to sing songs so filthy she would literally burn the hair out of your ears. Someone said that she had combined Sweet Georgia Brown and Alice Blue Gown and turned it into an ode to anal sex. So she's performing in a very risque way. She also wore the suit constantly. She had permission to wear it off the stage. She publicly married her girlfriend. On the other hand, she was also reputed to have slept with almost every Broadway actress who liked women, and they would make pilgrimages up to New York, up to Harlem to see her perform, and she apparently had notches on her bedpost, including for one actress known as Lucille Luceur in those days. Does anyone know who that was? Joan Crawford, yes. Right. But Joan Crawford could go from being a chorus girl with a penchant for the ladies into being an actress because she was white. So that gives a sense of the limitations of career. We also have Storm de la Verrier, who was performed with the Jewel Box Revue. Both of these women performed in what we can think of as a gay context. Gladys Bentley within a gay black context with white audience coming if they're daring enough. Storm was in the first interracial drag show and was the only woman in that show, sometimes performing as a woman, sometimes performing as a man, getting everybody thoroughly confused. But by the mid-20th century, it was a subcultural thing, and it was less and less common for particularly white actresses to do this because they needed to maintain their decency. So this then gets us to questions of decency and evidence of homosexuality. One of the things that's difficult is in tracking some of these 19th century women's. I mean, it's very tempting to look at a woman in a suit and go, oh, my lesbian foremothers, this is what got me into this research, this is what I was looking for. I failed. I mean, it was very disappointing because my first contact was Vesta Tilley. Turns out she was Lady de Vries, married to a Tory. Yes, indeed. She was thoroughly homophobic and nobody's idea of a good time. So I was really shattered to find that out. I eventually had to figure out, okay, I'm not looking at gayness here, I'm actually looking at class warfare with a specialty that allowed remarkable women, including the ones who liked the ladies, to succeed. It was always a small specialty. So here we have the evidence on Annie Hindle. Her first marriage was to Charles Vivian. This is the founder of the Elks. You all know what the Elks are, right? That was a theatrical fraternal organization. He was not a very nice man. They were married for maybe 6 weeks. She later claimed that he blacked both of her eyes. I believe her. And the reason I believe her is that he, almost immediately after they split, headed to the West Coast, and anytime he came over to the East Coast, the theatrical newspaper put it in the gossip section with lots of innuendo about what could happen. In other words, they were signaling that he was back, and they were watching out for her. I think he was banished, literally. The next marriage was to Nellie Howard, a dancer. The next year, I don't know what happened to Nellie Howard. I think she kept dancing. I think they just split. The next year, Annie Hindle married Blanche Duvier, who turns out to have been Blanche Selwyn. Basically, she changed her name, she was apprenticing with Annie Hindle. They were performing together. And then she changed her name. She almost immediately married a theater manager who could help her career. And once her career was launched, she then married a fellow performer. You notice I'm not talking about divorces, right? Nobody divorced. It was a working class divorce. Because there's no central record keeping, no one knows. So you go to City Hall, you get married. In fact, Annie Hindle married Nellie Howard and Blanche Duvier 1 year apart in Washington. So she went to the same registry, presumably. So anyway, Blanche Selwyn splits from her. In 1878, Annie Hindle was reputed to have married W. W. Long, who was a much older minstrel performer. I think she had to do business. I think she needed to be Mrs. Someone. Because they never married together, and the marriage was reported in the gags section of the theatrical newspaper. In other words, they knew full well it was a fake marriage. And they never lived together. They said, he set out on the road the next day. So clearly she just needed the status. In 1886, and this is the one everybody knows about, she married Annie Ryan in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a Baptist minister performed the marriage. I'll let that sit for a minute. Yeah, it's sweet. Because Grand Rapids, Michigan is the home of Michigan Republicans. Yeah, and we know the Baptists, right? So basically, they act as though that was the end of her career. I thought it was the end of her career until newspapers came up online and I could start to track her a little easier. It turns out that actually it wasn't the end of her career. The troupe just kept on going. When they interviewed people in her company, the women said, "Oh, I am so shocked. I had no idea." Annie Hindle and Annie Ryan were married until 1891 when Annie Ryan died. And it's reported in New York Herald, I believe. And they report on the funeral, and they say to her, "Well, do you want to be referred to as sir or ma'am?" She's like, "I don't care." She was mourning her wife. Her agent at the time, Bijou Price, who had briefly been a male impersonator, actually was performing sometime as a male impersonator and a theater manager and breeding dogs and running a hotel for actors in New Jersey. Yeah, hustling, right? And running a theatrical agency and living with her sister, depicted in Domestic Bliss with the sister, with her always looking manly. She came and she brought Annie Hindle to her house. This hints that there's this whole network of women that we can't prove was there, but I'm sure was there, and I keep looking for clues for it. So Annie Hindle goes back on the stage, and in 1892 she marries Louise Spangell in Albany, and it's reported in the newspaper, shock horror. Louise comes on the stage with her, and she calls herself Louise Hindle. Right? She's taken her wife or husband's name. And they perform for about a year, and then Louise dies. My suspicion is it was hard. Being on the stage, you had to be physically very, very tough. Chances of you getting sick were great. If you had any kind of, particularly with colds and the flu and whatever was going around, you could end up with chest infections incredibly fast. And no antibiotics, you die. So I think that's what happened to Louise. And then there's no more record of Annie Hindle after 1904 when she was performing in Toledo. I have no death date for her, I have nothing else. But you can see, I mean, we have 6 official marriages, and then Augusta Gershner, who sued her for the value of jewelry that was pawned to sustain them both during tough times. Augusta Gershner was her dresser, a servant, they said. Yeah, no servant pawns their jewelry to sustain themselves and their boss. They find a different boss, right? They'd broken up, and Augusta Gershner had gone off and got married and was a little resentful. We also have Ella Wesner, who eloped with Helen Josephine Mansfield, one of the most scandalous women of the 19th century, who caused the death of Colonel Fisk, who was assassinated by his business rival and rival for her, business partner and rival for her affections. I also have put Beatrice Lillie in there because Beatrice Lillie, a Canadian male impersonator, very quickly leaves Pants Behind. She moves to England eventually, works in revue, marries Bobby Peel, Sir Robert Peel, and reputed to be gay. They have one son, and then they never, that's it. They found the heir, and she continues on the stage. Theatre people might know that Beatrice Lillie was Judy Garland before Judy Garland. You would show up to one of her performances, half the audience was men sitting in couples, the other half were straight people who were confused. And her favorite thing to do was to sing, her song was, "There are fairies at the bottom of my garden." And you can imagine what she did with that. She's more famous for doing the routine about ordering a dozen double damask dinner napkins, which there's a recording of it. If you can find it, it's fantastic. I've also put Gladys and Stormy on here, but you can see how for anyone who was white, after a certain point, they left the pants behind. For Ella Wesner, she only had the one public scandal, and it was early enough in the 1870s that her manager could intercede, they could rehabilitate her career, and she performed into the early 20th century. Annie Hindle, however, was so notorious that it became part of her lore. And they would just talk about her as the female husband. Oh, isn't this interesting? She got married again, shock horror. And it just became part of her shtick, apparently, that people knew that she'd been married to men and to women. And this is Annie Hindle's 3 of her spouses, including Nellie Howard in the middle. Ella Wesner's love, Helen Josephine Mansfield. And then we get to the end. What happens to drag in the 20th century? On one hand, it goes into the subculture, mostly male to female, because men are public. Women can't be that public. So what happens is that you see drag depicted in one of 2 ways in the 20th century, especially in the context of film. We have Marlene Dietrich, who kind of follows on in the Sarah Bernhardt vein, which is the idea that foreigners are perverse. So they have all these weird perversions. And so she played with that in the films, where she would kind of flirt with women. She would dress in drag. She smoked. She behaved in very unfeminine ways, and it was part of her appeal that you could enjoy her doing it, but she wasn't like a decent woman because she was foreign. On the other hand, we have people like Betty Grable, who this is a still from the movie Mother Wore Tights. Occasionally, in the context of movies about vaudeville, you'll get these nostalgic flashbacks to vaudeville performance, and that is where you occasionally see male impersonation. sometimes also in biopics. So, for example, up as part of the films, actually it's playing right now, we have Julie Andrews in the Gertrude Lawrence biopic. Gertrude Lawrence, by the way, was very good friends with Beatrice Lillie. And Beatrice Lillie's comment on that film was, funny, they don't depict me at all. Right? So we have biopics and nostalgia. The other thing that we have, and it's not until much later, and it's sort of nostalgia, is things like Victor Victoria, which is a revival of an early 20th century German film, Perverse. And then it's reworked by Julie Andrews and Blake Edwards, thank you. I never remember his last name, Blake Edwards. And then what happens is you have her performing. Now, if you know that lesbians exist in the world, Victor Victoria doesn't work. Just doesn't work. It only works in a world without lesbians. But by the 1980s, when they were doing this, most straight folk had forgotten that male impersonation had ever happened. So my favorite fact about Julie Andrews is Julie Andrews worked with Ella Shields. Ella Shields was an American who had seen Ella Wesner perform when she was a child. When interviewed, she said her act was more like Ella Wesner's act than Vesta Tilley's act. So we can think about Julie Andrews as being the last of that line. That when we watch her perform, that's as close as we're ever going to get to seeing Ella Wesner perform. And just for some fun, I have, yes, here is some Ella Shields from 1929.
The governor said like a wise old dad, time you choose a trade, my lad. I sit right that very night. I joined the King Davy. I dipped my ensign through the crew, saucy yet polite. When Admiral Beatty winked and said, now Britain is all right. And the captain said he to me, Bill, my lad, put it there, matey. I said, right, gripped him tight, both of them were pals. Then I told one tale and he told two. And you talk about the sea being blue, well, you know the sort of tales they be, where the captain and the meeting in the King Davy. One day alongside of the old Grey Key, I slipped off mysteriously, stayed on shore an hour or more, and met two charming girls. I linked them all around the town, spent all I could afford, but what a bloomin' row there was when I got back on board.
So you notice she's not really singing. She was perfectly capable of singing. This is a woman who started her career performing between vaudeville and burlesque, doing syncopated pop songs of the late 19th, early 20th century. She was a belter, and she had a very, very powerful voice, but she also knew how to make a character, and she is doing that kind of using pitch strategically to reinforce character, as opposed to singing. This is the hardest thing when you're working with live performers, is they want to sing this stuff, and I'm like, no. Use pitch to help you shape the narrative in the song. And the last one go on YouTube. It is a rabbit hole you will never get out of. I want to finish with a little of Gladys Bentley, partly because it gives you a sense of the strength of her performance. But this is Gladys Bentley from 2 years before she died, at which point she had retired. She'd moved to the West Coast, where she was again entertaining in gay clubs that mostly, I think, drew entertainers. She's very much an entertainer for entertainers. But she was in dresses. And she had to be, because it was no longer permissible for her to wear a suit. We were in the Cold War, we got through the lavender scare, And she really could not work out there except in the most limited way. And when she died, she'd apparently ordained as a minister, and she was more and more involved in a black church in LA. I was thinking that would be a hell of a show, wouldn't it? So this is her on, it's the on You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx, who clearly, if you watch the whole clip, adores her. Oops. Can we turn the volume up on this?
You make me oh so happy. You make me blue. All in love, starting in a great big way for you. Young man, you started something with them there eyes. Watch out, brown eyes, if you're wise. They sparkle, they bubble. Get you in a whole lot of trouble, yeah. Baby, them there
So you get a sense of the strength of her as a performer, but no longer able to wear a suit. And because she's on television, it's the G-rated version. I'm betting in the gay club, she sang some pretty filthy stuff still. So that gives you a sense of what happens to it in the 20th century and why it's been forgotten. Why even when the drag kings started, I was watching drag kings performing in the 1990s, they didn't know male impersonation existed, because it had been so completely forgotten by theatrical history that they had to reinvent the wheel. So we'll leave it there.
I've been looking for someone to love, someone just like you. I've been asking the stars up above to find someone like you. Now that I have found you, dear, I always want to keep you near me. I'm lonesome and blue, but when I look at you, there's one thing I know is true. I wouldn't be lonesome, I wouldn't be blue if I had a girl like you. I've waited a lifetime, I've hated the nighttime, for long nights have made me blue. I wouldn't be hating, I wouldn't be waiting if I had a girl like you. I don't know why I'm feeling the way I do. I hope that I haven't made a mistake in you. Everything seems like one of my dreams. Wake me up and say it's true. I wouldn't be dreaming, I wouldn't be scheming if I had a girl like you. I've been asking for someone like you, someone just like you. I've been asking the stars up above to find someone like you. Now that I've found you, dear, I always want to keep you near me. I'm lonesome and blue, but when I look at you, there's one thing I know it wouldn't be lonely. lonesome I would if I had a girl like you. I've waited a lifetime, I've hated the nighttime. Those long nights have made me blue. I wouldn't be waiting, I wouldn't be hating if I had a girl like you. I don't know why I'm feeling the way I do. I hope that I haven't made a mistake in you. Everything seems like one of my dreams. Wake me up and say it's true. I wouldn't be dreaming, I wouldn't be scheming if I had a girl like you.
I have got a sweetie known as Susie. In the words of Shakespeare, she's a wow. And though all of you may know her too, I'd like to shout right now. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a girl. There's none so classy as this fair lassie. Holy Moses, what a chassis! We went riding, she didn't balk. Back from Yonkers, I'm the one that had to walk. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a girl. Susie has a perfect reputation. No one ever saw her on a spree. Nobody knows where Susie goes. Nobody knows but me. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a girl. Out in public, sure she can yawn. But in the parlor, you would think the war was on. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a girl. Mais non, c'est Susie, que gentille Susie. Ouh, qui c'est chérie? Oh, enchantée, mademoiselle. Ooh, holy Moses, what a chassis! I had a mustache trained from a pup. She had such hot lips, she kissed me once and burned it up. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a gal. Come on, sing with me. If you knew Susie like I know Susie, oh, what a gal. There's none so classy as this fair lassie. Oh, you know this. Oh, holy Moses, what a chassis. Out in public, sure she can yawn. In the parlor,